My name is Laura Shin, and I am the host of a couple of podcasts on crypto and blockchain. One is called Unchained, and the other is called Unconfirmed.
I'll go next. I mean, I think it's helpful to start by understanding, having a kind of common understanding of what what blockchain technology is, because I'm sure many of us see headlines about ICOs or coins, and for some of us that might characterize this term blockchain, but it's really this underlying technology that is this novel break from what was possible before, which is a technology that's a little bit of a database, it's a little bit of a network, but what it's really for is bringing together a consortium of participants, sometimes a consortium as large as the whole wide internet, sometimes as small as simply 4 or 5 organizations that need a common system. And what it does is establishes a common ground truth without needing somebody at the center to play God. And that's useful in almost any scenario where you have multiple parties who don't necessarily, distrust each other entirely. They trust each other enough to do business with each other, but they need some way of being able to verify the things that they trust, right? Some way to agree, here's a transaction 2 parties did, and that becomes now a part of a long-term record, right? Here's a statement that was made by one party about another, and now everyone remembers that. So it gives us this history of what happened, this kind of immutable ledger. Obviously, it's more immutable the more participants are on it, and Metcalfe's law still applies, which is the value of these networks is still greater the more participants are on it. And so it turns out there's a bunch of use cases that today signify for us low trust environments where we need to have that history of transactions. In supply chain, that's a pretty obvious thing, whether we're tracking food and where that's entered the system to try to make sure that if lettuce goes bad, that we can try to isolate where it went bad and do a recall on just those products rather than all lettuce in the entire food chain, as it's happened recently and cost that industry billions of dollars. Whether it's diamonds and where they've come out of the ground to make sure you're not buying diamonds mined by slave labor or used in gun purchases, weapons purchases, that sort of thing. Or fish caught by fish quotas. But it turns out there's lots of other transaction types as well. Settlements between financial organizations, those sorts of things, or even just the establishment of common directories. In healthcare, for example, there are applications of this to keeping track of who's credentialed to serve as a surgeon or as any type of like medical profession. And when they move from one state to another, today it often can take weeks for a doctor properly credentialed to earn the right to be able to practice, weeks or months, when really that should be a simple lookup into a common shared directory. So there are live projects now in all of those sectors, meaning either late stage pilot or production, and these are all kind of a world away from the cryptocurrency use cases we all know about, but are starting to provide some value and hinting at potentially applicability to every sector out there.
Did develop a toolkit. We call it Blockchain Beyond the Hype, and it came out at the end of April. And it's designed to give a quick initial assessment of whether or not blockchain is appropriate to the problem at hand. Blockchain is a technology, and it is not a solution to everything. And we think it's very important to recognize that it is more applicable to certain kinds of problem spaces than to others. So to answer your question more directly, we tend to focus on the removal of an intermediary or a broker. So is that something that you're trying to accomplish? Is there a reason that you want to decentralize or disintermediate what you're doing? We also look at things like, is there a benefit to having an immutable record, a transaction record? Or was that actually something you don't want? I think it's interesting to just briefly note with the challenges of GDPR and the right to be forgotten that GDPR is intended to provide to citizens of the EU. What does that mean for the creation of an immutable record in terms of data? These are interesting kinds of policy and regulation questions that come into play. And you have to be very mindful of your regulatory environment when you think about the creation of an immutable record and what that means. Who should have access to that record? Is it important that multiple parties have a single source of truth? It may be that that's not the case. And in many cases, we find that when you really push on a particular potential use case, you wind up realizing that the permanence, it's really immutability, but the permanence is not desirable for some reason or another, or that you really wind up with a benefit to having centralization. that there is such an obvious authority figure on the transaction record that you're trying to create, as an example, that it might be worthwhile to explore other options that already exist rather than moving immediately or directly to blockchain. That being said, we're certainly quite optimistic about the use of blockchain, particularly as the technology evolves. It's still quite an early stage technology, but as it evolves, these are all known problems, and there are, I will say, brilliant minds, and many of them, working on the protocol layer to solve some of these problems, to increase speed, to increase throughput. All these kinds of things are things that are being focused on by the technologists in the space.
I find that interesting because those companies have, pretty entrenched processes. So, what was your pitch, and how did you convince them to, especially at the time that you did it, it was 2015, which definitely was a different era from 2018 where we are now, where everybody is experimenting in this. 2015 definitely was, kind of the Bitcoin is criminal money days, and it was long before even this blockchain, not Bitcoin mantra became part of the blockchain hype that we're discussing. So how did you make that pitch and convince them?
It wasn't easy. It actually tended to start with me educating, or our team educating, a set of executives about Bitcoin. In fact, the curiosity around Bitcoin was very real in 2015, 2014 even, and still today. So that tended to be the way the doors were opened. And then it became a conversation about, now that you understand the model that is Bitcoin, let's think about sort of a similar architecture, but instead of around a new currency, around existing currencies, or around existing assets. And that tended to be the way the conversations became meaningful and interesting. And since you brought up blockchain, not Bitcoin, that was also the kind of dominant narrative at Davos this year, right? Was as someone that works in the space, usually that was the nature of the dialogue with folks that I met at the event. And I encouraged people there, and I'll encourage people here, to not be trapped by that dichotomy, to not get into the one is better than the other, blockchain is better than Bitcoin, Bitcoin is better than blockchain. They're two incredibly different arenas still. When I think blockchain, quote unquote, I think primarily about a context where you have existing financial assets and you're trying to put them into a new type of market infrastructure. And that's not really competitive with Bitcoin or other crypto assets. Those other crypto assets are creating an alternative system, an alternative set of software services that have a totally different arc and possible future to them. And I think it actually behooves folks not to view them as one threatens the other, but to understand them on their own terms.
Yeah, I think predominantly the value that's going to be realized in the next 5 years will be in a B2B setting rather than B2C. I mean, with cryptocurrencies aside, because I think that is very much a consumer-driven kind of thing, even with the institutional interest in it now, it's predominantly about serving their clients, so I consider it more C rather than B. A lot of the stories will be about, here's a set of banks that now have a settlement network between them. Here's a set of participants in a supply chain that now have a provenance tracking system between them. And in many cases, ROI will be very elusive, right? It won't be easy to measure cost savings, right? You'll have flashes of this if Maersk is able to say, hey, we've cut the cost of the paperwork and delay in getting a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles by 30%. That's great. There'll be little bits of that, but it'll be hard to systematically, I think, say, that the GDP generated by, or cost savings by net this usage is a number of billions, in the same way that it was hard to make that case for the web, for the internet, when so much of that impact was implicit or kind of ephemeral in a way. But I think a lot of it will be there. Where I think the next wave will hit the B2C space, though, thanks to blockchain technology, will be around identity. I think with distributed ledgers, with some of these underlying tools, we now have the ability to get closer to there's a second whole big world called self-sovereign identity that builds upon blockchain technology in some meaningful ways. And this is a way to get out of the trap of login with Facebook, login with Twitter, and get closer to something that acts a little bit more like the IDs in your wallet, like the diploma you have on your wall, like the medical records that, in theory, you should be able to take around from institution to institution. And blockchain technology, there's a bunch of projects out there that are focused on using that to invert the relationship between consumer and identity provider and put much more power and agency, kind of very much following along the GDPR kind of view of how the world should work. And that gets a lot of us really excited in this space.
I just want to frame this actually a little bit more, which is that obviously as a journalist, I get pitched a ton of startups and projects. And one time somebody pitched me their new startup, which was going to be some kind of like time stamping, sort of like a notary. And I think they were, I don't know if they used the word notary, but it was something like, you know, we're going to put this data in the blockchain. And I said, oh, how do you prevent false data from entering the blockchain? The guy literally did not have an answer for me. And I was just amazed that they hadn't thought of this. It was my first question for him. And it was something, you know, and I said, well, you could put like a spam email in there. And he was like, well, yes, then we would prove that the existence of that spam email existed at that moment in time. And I was like, okay, this is not useful to, well, I didn't think it was. So, yeah, so how do you ensure the integrity of the data?
I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. This is like one of the perennial problems, you know. So I often joke that we talk about garbage in, garbage out problems in technology, and this is really garbage in forever, you know, kind of problem. So if you haven't, you know, sanitized and done data hygiene on your database, it's a big issue. We're looking at a policy project on anti-corruption work. And one of the challenges and tensions in blockchain is how do you preserve some measure of, it's pseudonymous systems, how do you preserve some measure of privacy and security to an individual, for example, who's logging a complaint of some kind, right, against a system, whether that's logging a harassment complaint against a manager or whatever at a company, or whether it's logging a corruption complaint against a public official, for example. How do you balance that with this troll bot spam problem, where if you do enable someone to anonymously, and we see this on the internet all the time, you enable people to anonymously comment on something, what they say, you know, there's a lot of latitude in how accurate that really is, and the ability for others to glom onto that, even in an automated fashion, and kind of just fill your database with junk data. So I don't have a great answer to it. I think it is a perennial problem, and I think it's one of the reasons that we remain cautious about the use of blockchains. If you aren't confident that you have an authoritative source of truth, that the record you're creating is an accurate record, not to mention a meaningful record, right, which I think is also important, something we gloss over, in my opinion, too much. If you can't do that, then this is perhaps, it can even be a dangerous technology, frankly, if that's not a solved problem.
But I do believe, just to add to that, I do believe that with blockchain, it's a little easier for you to ensure data integrity. For example, if my identity is on the blockchain and I'm not sharing every piece of information with every single person around, it's a little less easy for someone to steal my identity. And if you link data that's entered to a valid user, at that point in time, you can be more, the probability of data being entered by the right individual is higher than it would be, you know, since you cannot steal identity that easily. On top of that, what we do a lot of times in the supply chain use cases is you use IoT, right, at any point in time to link the actual physical with the digital. So that's another way we are trying to make sure that data in the blockchain is more accurate. Of course, you can go and tamper each single piece of IoT device, but that would be challenging given, you know, you can set other things around it.
An example of that would be, so a boat shows up at port with a load of tuna that it claimed that it caught in this one region at this one time that would put it within the quotas for a certain country, right? And yet you have data from sensors, tamper-proof sensors on the boat, even on the nets. There are companies that sell tamper-proof GPS sensing and video sensing sensors for nets, as well as satellite data from sensors on buoys out in the water. All of that data could be writing to the ledger, signed by the entities that, you know, built these sensors, right, and used used to either enhance the integrity of the claim that this boat is making, that it caught this fish at this place at this time, or to refute it. Right? And this is data that could feed auditing processes, could feed other types of checks and balances, perhaps even feed a whistleblowing or investigative journalist kind of framework that would give us a greater sense of integrity to claims that are being made about these types of things.